You're listening to The World at 8 with Lynn Mozart. The World at 8, the number one in nationalist news.
Highlights of the news today, Wednesday the 25th of April. Older workers to be marginalised once again. Social cleansing benefit cap row. Abolition of primary care trusts could endanger children's health. South Sudan accuses Khartoum of declaring war. Sarkozy rules out deal with far right. Thought for the day, our elderly and their twilight years. UK news. Older workers to be marginalised once again. Employers can force retirement if in public interest. Employers can force retirement of older workers if it is in the public interest, a landmark court ruling signalled on Wednesday. The court ruling gave the green light for companies to dismiss older workers at 65 to make space for more entry-level jobs and younger staff climbing the career ladder, just months after the government made this practice unlawful. The legal firm Clarkson, Wright and Jakes said retiring all partners at 65 was acceptable as it allowed associates to move up the ranks to partnership and gave the workforce reasonable expectations on when senior vacancies would arise. The courts agreed. What is really the difference? For many older workers, finding, much less holding on to a job into their 60s or even 70s was and looks to remain an unrealistic expectation. Also, this landmark company is a professional law firm. Partners are always legal professionals. They can set up independently at any age or sit on executive committees. This ruling is hardly comparable with Joe Bloggs working in a white or blue-collar non-professional capacity in the workplace today. Social cleansing housing benefit cap row. Duncan Smith hits back. Labour's Labour-controlled Newham Council is trying to find homes for some 500 families 160 miles away to meet the government's housing benefit cap. The council has been accused of social cleansing after Work and Pensions Secretary Ian Duncan Smith said there were thousands of houses within 5 miles of Newham which fell within the cap. Newham Council, which runs one of London's poorest boroughs in the east of the city and is home to much of the 500-acre Olympic Park, has written to Brighter Futures Housing Association in Stoke-on-Trent offering it the opportunity to lease its homes for up to 500 families on housing benefit. Brighter Futures Chief Executive Officer Jill Brown says she will not agree to the request. I think there is a real issue of social cleansing going on. We are very anxious about this letter, which we believe signals the start of a movement which could see thousands of needy people dumped in Stoke with no proper plan for their support or their welfare. Westminster Council are looking at similar proposals. It makes one wonder just who they are looking to remove from our nation's capital. Abolition of primary care trusts could endanger children's health. The NHS Confederation warns the bewildering structural reforms that will see the abolition of primary care trusts by 2013 could place vulnerable children at risk. Child health care to be divided amongst 4 different organisations with no clear lines of accountability. Joe Webber, Deputy Director of Policy at the NHS Confederation, said, "We know through painful experience that it is between the gaps in responsibilities that the most tragic and difficult cases fall. With nothing making these organisations work together in the way they should, we have to be honest that the risk of us failing is more likely. The time has come to be honest with government and together now resolve these issues before a policy problem becomes a tragic failure." The Guardian states, responsibility for safeguarding children is currently shared between local authorities and primary care trusts, PCTs. When PCTs are abolished under the reforms in 2013, that duty will be shared among the NHS Commissioning Board, Public Health England, clinical commissioning groups, CCGs and local councils. Was there ever a better recipe for disaster? European news. Sarkozy rules out deal with far right. French President Nicolas Sarkozy, while insisting that far-right supporters should not be demonised, has ruled out any deal with Le Front National. Marine Le Pen, their candidate, captured 18% of Sunday's vote in the presidential elections. This is the highest vote ever gained by a far-right candidate. Sarkozy is desperate for the 18% of the voters who voted for Le Pen and is tilting further to the right. He has said he will drastically reduce immigration and secure France's borders to defend the French way of life. He was quoted as saying, "We need to speak to the 18% who voted for Marine Le Pen. There will be no deal with Le Front National, no ministers for them, but I have to take them into account and not feel I have to hold my nose." It may be time for the far right to withhold their vote in the next round of presidential elections and concentrate on June's parliamentary elections. World News. South Sudan accuses Khartoum of declaring war. On Tuesday, South Sudan accused Khartoum on Tuesday of mounting bombing raids against the newly independent country's oil-producing border regions, claiming they were tantamount to a declaration of war. Weeks of cross-border fighting between the former civil war foes have threatened to escalate into a full-blown conflict in a region that holds one of Africa's most significant oil reserves. The disputes have already halted nearly all oil production, choking the two countries' largely oil-dependent economies. The major external power interested in Sudan is China, naturally with the UN's blessing. It is Chinese investment driving oil production in the Sudan and the promises of new pipelines to deliver oil to the eastern markets. This must be the reason that the UK, US and Europe are not really interested in the Sudanese blood being shed. The Chinese will have their oil. Thought for the day: our elderly and their twilight years. I have recorded the Panorama Undercover Elderly Care which was shown on 23rd but not yet seen it. This subject is too close to home for my liking. Not only am I getting older, thankfully the alternative doesn't appeal, but my mother suffered similar abuse. Not the physical lashings that Miss Worrell's mother suffered, unless you count being lifted by a broken wrist until spotted by me, physical abuse, but the lazy, ignorant, stupid and greedy people we seem to attract to this industry. Now, I'm not having a go at any ethnic carer or the good carers of many ethnicities. I know they are hard working and do the very best in often the worst circumstances, understaffed and underpaid. My youngest son is currently working with the elderly in dementia care and has to operate under strict guidelines, and even he says that they would do more if they had more staff. We have to understand that nowadays the elderly infirm are marginalised, not only by lack of money, but by a general lack of respect for those in their twilight years. We live now in an age of built-in obsolescence. Once it is broken, do not mend, buy another. Sack them at 65 and expect them to get another job and work till they're 70. This seems to apply mainly to our indigenous population growing older. I saw in a daily a couple of months ago a ridiculous picture, that of a young girl wearing weights and whatever around her body to feel and show what moving around felt like when you were old. What a nerve! There are many poor people who feel pain every day of the week moving around, and they are not always elderly. But it shows the amount of respect we are shown. Nil. We are encouraged as a nation to look out for lack of memory in our old relatives, and then, joy oh joy, we can shove them into a home and sell their houses, preferably to a large immigrant family, to breed more youngsters for our country. I'm sure you get where I'm coming from. We are, as a nation, killing off our old people to justify the media predictions. The elderly population will be a drag on our economy, and the young will never earn enough to keep paying for them or indeed themselves in their older years. Well, good for them. If you believe that, you're well on the way to contributing to yet another form of social and ageist engineering taking place in the UK. Old people's homes, care homes or whatever they call themselves are neither. Whether private or NHS, nowadays they mostly seem to operate under the same structure. No matron or person to crack the whip, a mishmash of white and ethnic workers, and no respect whatsoever for their patients or clients or customers or whatever the buzzword is for the poor dears now. I can sympathise with Miss Morell. It must have been terrible for her to actually observe her mother's so-called care, but even worse for those who have not got a camera to put into their relatives' rooms. It is always worse to imagine, even in hindsight, than to actually see. My mother died weighing less than 4 stone. The 5 years it took a long and awful history. Suffice to say she was fit and well up to the stay in a private wing of a local hospital. I removed her after 6 weeks of their care, and she could not walk, even though she had walked in. We had to take her to a private care home. In both her homes this care really went downhill when both homes took on Filipino staff, straight off the boat. Now, I'm not going to have a hymn of hate against these people, because many, I'm sure, do a very good job, but their people ethic, more than the West Indians, is not of our culture, as indeed the African one is not. I remarked on many occasions that my mother, who had always been slim, was getting gaunt. The Filipino cheerfully remarked, "In my country I have seen thinner than that." There you have it in a nutshell. When so-called carers come into the country nowadays, they bring their culture with them. They do not adapt to our culture. This Jonathan Aquino is, I would presume, Filipino, and rightly deserves to be deported now and serve his sentence in the Philippines. I noticed, as did Miss Worrell, that food was changed for my mother as well. One would think that we daughters do not visit, take food or care, but we do. The awful thing is you have to trust the people who you and your parent pay to do just that. I reported my mother's last home to the CQC and they did a notified inspection after 6 months. The report was huge and apparently this home was exemplary. Could anyone tell me if we have any sort of arrangement with the Philippine government to take their semi-qualified nursing staff away from their country? I remember when my grandmother was in a home in outer London about 40 years ago and we used to visit her. There were the usual white drongos doing bugger all, but I do not think that the scenes I will watch on Panorama were endemic in those days, as indeed they seem to be now, in our hospitals, nursing homes and care homes. Is it really a cultural or ethnic problem? It would seem so. We have changed as a society, but our elderly have not. I had a small fir tree in a large pot. It was not growing well, so I put it in the ground near to other fir trees, and it grew bigger and better. The moral? People, whatever their age, still want to be looked after by their own tribe, preferably their own blood. You do not see many immigrant elderly in our care homes. Just their children, caring for ours. And finally, you could only see these headlines in the Western world. Dull is a twin with boring. The Scottish village of Dull is to forge links with a US town called Boring. This odd partnership came about after a cyclist from Scotland, Elizabeth Layton, who knew of Dull in Perthshire, pedalled through Boring in the American town of Oregon. News was relayed back to villagers in Dull, who immediately made contact with their US counterparts in an effort to set up Dull and Boring. Tourism agency Visit Scotland, tasked with attracting visitors to Scotland, said the move was yet more evidence of the world-famous Scottish sense of humour. You can just imagine the road sign required here, can't you? Dull, twinned with boring. You have been listening to The World at 8. I am Lynn Mozar and I wish you all a very good night. Senior vacancies would arise. The courts agreed. What is really the difference? For many older workers, finding, much less holding on to a job into their 60s or even 70s was and looks to remain an unrealistic expectation. Also, this landmark company is a professional law firm. Partners are always legal professionals. They can set up independently at any age or sit on executive committees. This ruling is hardly comparable.
You're listening to The World at 8 with Lynn Mozar. In nationalist news.
Highlights of the news today, Wednesday the 25th of April. Older workers to be marginalised once again. Social cleansing benefits in the public interest, a landmark court ruling signalled on Wednesday. The court ruling gave the green light for companies to dismiss older workers at 65 to make space for more entry-level jobs and younger staff climbing the career ladder, just months after the government made this practice unlawful. The legal firm Clarkson, Wright and Jakes said retiring all partners at 65 was acceptable as it allowed associates to move up the ranks to partnership and gave the workforce reasonable expectations on when benefit cap row. Abolition of primary care trusts could endanger children's health. South Sudan accuses Khartoum of declaring war. Sarkozy rules out deal with far right. Thought for the day, our elderly and their twilight years. UK news. Older workers to be marginalised once again. Employers can force retirement if in public interest. Employers can force retirement of older workers if it is comparable with Joe Bloggs working in a white or blue collar non-professional capacity in the workplace today. Social cleansing housing benefit cap row. Duncan Smith hits back. Labour's Labour-controlled Newham Council is trying to find homes for some 500 families 160 miles away to meet the government's housing benefit cap. The council has been accused of social cleansing after Work and Pensions Secretary Ian Duncan Smith said there were